This film is coming to you from by far the least romantic setting so far. I'm sat on the top bunk of a dorm of a hostel in Buenos Aires, but it's quiet and there's nobody around, so I'm taking this opportunity in this unromantic setting to talk to you about a very romantic subject, which is the Oedipus Complex. So I'm not going to actually say too much about the Oedipus Complex. Freud writes about it well before he actually names it, before he calls it the Oedipus Complex, before he recalls the Sophoclean myth. But when he describes what unconsciously the child or the subject feels towards his parents even in the late 1890s, I think, certainly in the early 1900s, really what he's describing is the Oedipus Complex, even if it's not named. And in the early 20s, in The Ego and the Id, he reiterates it again, but in the context of the ego, and how the ego is really nothing but an aggregate of various abandoned love objects. So briefly, what the Oedipus Complex is. So originally, we have the child has a biological need for food, for milk. This biological need turns into a sensual desire for something else, something other than food, the breast, the body connected to the breast, the mother, the other. So the child moves from biological need, pure and simple, to sexuality, where the mother is now an object of love. In fact, she's the sole object of love, and there's this kind of me and you versus the world type, very dyadic, intense, two-person relationship that develops. And this just cannot continue. This two-person, intense mother-child relationship can't continue. It's not sustainable. And why not? Well, this is where I think the way that the Oedipus Complex is sometimes told, the nuancing doesn't feel quite right to me. It's often seen as the father coming in a very threatening manner and cutting off this poor child from its mother. I don't quite think, perhaps it's partly that, but it's certainly not primarily that from my point of view. So when I was about 4, my mum got together with my stepdad, and although I don't remember feeling jealous or threatened by this new man in my infant life, I've always kind of thought, isn't it strange how when I was a little boy, and I had no rivals for my mother's love, suddenly when this funny man with a bald head and glasses and a son turned up, I didn't seem too bothered. In fact, I seemed to kind of quite like him. And I've kind of always thought, wouldn't you have thought that I'd be a bit put out, really, that I no longer had my mum to myself? And I think that in that question lies the misconception of the Oedipus situation, that the child feels the third person who intrudes upon the relationship with the mother as a threat. I think the child feels that third person as a relief, or perhaps threat and relief are experienced as a single kind of aggregate feeling. And I think the child feels relief because a relationship with one other person is always just a bit too much, in a sense. So, in between this dyadic mother-child relationship, the father intervenes, or we should say the function of the father, and this is really critical. What I mean by the function of the father, and Lacan clarifies this, I think, the function of the father, or the paternal function. What's meant by that is a third element which cuts through the mother-child relationship. And it may very well not be a biological father. It may, as it was in my case, it may be a stepfather, or it may be another female parent, or it may be the mother's job, or the mother's other interests. But it's a third element which comes in, and what it must do, I think, is to provoke some kind of realization in the child that the mother's desire lies elsewhere. It lies in other places as well as me, as well as the child. And that realization will evoke all sorts of questions, all the questions that are at the heart of neurosis. And what place can I fill? What does she want from me? Who am I for the other? And that includes the other that is part of me. So, and this really is Lacan's contribution to the Oedipus complex, that you-me relationship is replaced by a triangular relation. You, me, and a third. And opening up the space for that third element, opening up that possibility of a third element coexisting with you and me, means that the child can conceive of other people, of society, of language, of communication, of the symbolic order as a whole. I should probably say as an aside that actually Lacan says that there's always that third element there somewhere. There's always the sense of a possibility that the mother loves something beyond the child. There's always the possibility that the mother is lacking something, wanting in both senses of the word. And lack is synonymous with desire. Want means both lack and desire. So if there's no lack, there's no desire. And somewhere from the child's point of view, and of course the child is also fundamentally lacking, and there's an awareness of that lack in the child, because the child knows that he or she is not everything, doesn't completely satisfy the desire of the mother. But the child may experience an invitation or even a demand to fill the lack in the mother. And that's a potentially a tempting, seductive proposition, but it's also a terrifying one. The thought that I could be everything for the other is a terrifying proposition. And the father function, the third element that intervenes, can stand in for that lack. And in doing so, he denies the child the possibility of filling that lack. And this is what both Freud and Lacan call castration. And as I said earlier, I think castration is as much of a relief as it is a frustrating disappointment. Dylan Evans, in his Lacanian dictionary, says the subject is freed from the impossible and anxiety-provoking task of having to be the phallus by realizing that the father has the phallus. And that means that the child can step out of this rivalrous competitive relationship with the father, or with society, with the father function, and instead identify with him. And so we're back to where we started with the ego and the id, the emergence of the superego, the foundation of the ego from abandoned love relationships. Just one final thing that I'm going to say here, and this goes against the kind of contemporary grain a little bit. Many people, I think, you see this all over Facebook, they think of anxiety as stemming from a lack of strong attachments, as we think of separation anxiety. And this is not wrong, but it ignores the fact that parental relationships, sexual relationships, romantic relationships, friendships, professional relationships, all relationships are intense and anxiety-provoking, fundamentally. And this is why we say to friends, shall we meet up for a beer? We don't just say, shall we meet up? There always has to be a reason, a reason for meeting up. And the beer, in that example, the beer itself acts as a third element. It dilutes the intensity of the encounter with the other. And that's what I think this is the fundamental thing really about the Oedipus complex, the diluting impact of a third element. My analyst once told me, actually very early on, in one of our very early sessions, that one of the most disturbing things he ever heard a patient say was I'm going to try to only masturbate to thoughts and images of my wife. And yeah, I find this a worrying idea as well. I think it's essential to have a fantasy object, or fantasy objects who are not your wife or your husband or your partner, however monogamous you are. because the role of this fantasy third element in an adult relationship is kind of the same as that of the real third in a childhood relationship. And I think a great many problems are caused by adults who feel they can't have a fantasy third. And a great many connected problems occur when adults think that a real third person will cure all of their anxieties.